This happened several years ago, up in the massive, unforgiving stretch of the Flathead National Forest in Montana. I was hiking a loop with Scarlett, my girlfriend at the time. I was generally the level-headed one, but Scarlett, she was the barometer for every uneasy feeling. My goal for the final night was a minor peak that held a relic of a bygone era, one of the old deactivated U.S. Forest Service fire lookout towers. These wooden skeletons perched on the highest, loneliest points were once the eyes of the forest, built decades before technology rendered them obsolete. This one was designated as Tower 7, not on modern maps, just an obscure reference in an old trail guide. I planned to camp just under the tree line, a quarter-mile below it, and then scramble up for a sunrise that promised to be otherworldly. We hit the base of the peak around 4 p.m. The trail turned into a brutal vertical climb through dense subalpine fir. Scarlett was dragging her usual anxiety, manifesting as pure frictional irritability. She couldn't understand the appeal of a decommissioned tower. She just wanted a flat spot by the river. I gave her the usual spiel about the view, the history, and the elevation, keeping the bears away. When we finally broke through the tree line, there it was. Tower 7. 50 feet of rickety weathered wood, supporting a small glass cabin, the crow's nest at the top. It was a profoundly lonely structure, a dark silhouette against the rapidly darkening Montana sky. It looked every bit the 80-year-old forgotten ghost I had anticipated. But there was one thing wrong. One thing that instantly annihilated my sense of historical curiosity and replaced it with a hollow, gut-deep unease. There was a light on. It wasn't a modern, sharp LED. It was a soft, pale, flickering yellow glow, barely visible through the grime-caked windows of the cabin. It looked like the warm, sick heart of an old hurricane lamp beating alone in the vast darkness. Scarlett, in a flush of instantaneous, desperate relief, immediately exclaimed, "Thank God, a ranger. We can ask to use their radio or get water." My instinct screamed a solid no. Deactivated towers are supposed to be padlocked, boarded up, and often partially dismantled. No modern firewatch uses these ancient, dangerous structures. If someone was up there, they were either lost, illegal, or something else entirely. No rational Forest Service personnel would be operating out of this relic. "Stay here," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "I'm checking it out. Do not call out." I started walking up the final rocky slope. The wind was picking up, starting to whistle an eerie, high-pitched song through the tower's lattice supports. As I got closer, another sound began to punch through the wind noise, a sound that was absolutely, definitively wrong. It wasn't music or a radio or any kind of human speech. It was a low, relentless, rhythmic ticking, a slow, methodical, almost mechanical sound, like an enormous grandfather clock wound up too tight, or some manually operated timer patiently counting down something you did not want to know. It was deliberate, and it was entirely out of place. I reached the base. The stairs were missing risers, and the door was secured just as I'd expected, padlocked with a thick, rusty chain. But the wood wasn't decayed. It was worn, yes, but freshly maintained. I saw new-looking rebar bolted to the old support beams. The padlock was old, but the heavy-gauge chain securing it was new industrial-grade steel. This tower was supposed to be abandoned. Instead, it was locked, maintained, occupied, and ticking. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted loud and firm, trying to cut through the wind. "Hello, Forest Service. We're hikers below, just checking in." The yellow light at the top flickered once, a sharp, momentary acknowledgement. The slow, rhythmic ticking continued unwavering. No voice, no movement, no head looking down from the grime-caked windows. Just the light and the sound of something patient and ancient keeping time. I waited a minute, shouted again louder. Still nothing. The wind, the cold, the darkness, and that primal chill that had snaked up my spine all solidified the terror. Whoever was up there was choosing not to respond. Their silence felt hostile. It felt proprietary. I retreated to Scarlett, trying to project a sense of rational calm that had already deserted me. "It's locked," I told her, shouldering my pack. "And whoever is up there is ignoring us. Maybe they're deaf. We'll camp below the tree line and we'll be quiet. We'll get our sunrise and leave." Scarlett had seen my face. She looked up at the unnerving, sickly yellow glow, and her overreactor instinct was for the first time totally justified. Her face was bloodless. "I don't like it," she whispered. "It feels wrong. Let's go down now." I shook my head. "Too dark, Scarlett. We'd be off trail, falling down cliffs. We stay here below the tree line. We set up camp, we ignore the tower." I led her down about 300 yards to a secluded patch of pines. We set up our tent fast, barely speaking. If I looked up through the branches, I could still see that faint, malevolent yellow beacon silently, unblinkingly watching our every move. We ate a miserable cold dinner, zipped ourselves into the tent by 9 p.m., and listened to the constant abrasive roar of the mountain wind, trying desperately to pretend we were safe. I grabbed my cheap binoculars and aimed them out the flap. The yellow glow was clearer now, but the glass was too dirty, the distance too great. I couldn't see anything but the light and the dark cage of the tower's structure. I tried to manufacture a rational explanation, amateur radio operator, crazy hermit, anything. But the maintained structure, the new lock, and the deliberate refusal to answer had long since shredded any reasonable possibility. Then Scarlett's voice cut through the darkness, tight with fear. "Did you hear that I listened hard over the wind?" "Nothing." "A scraping," she insisted. "Metal on wood. It's coming down." I dismissed it as the wind playing a trick on the old broken railings. But a few minutes later, I heard it too. A sound utterly distinct from the roar of the wind, too slow, too heavy, too intentional. A very deliberate metal squeak. It was the sound of an old metal hinge under strain. It was the sound of a heavy outer door being slowly, painstakingly opened. And it was coming from the cabin 50 feet above us. I slammed the binoculars against my eyes. And that's when the terror escalated from psychological to imminent. The pale yellow hurricane lamp was still glowing steadily inside the cab. But now, a second completely separate light appeared just outside the cab door. It was an intensely bright, modern tactical white beam of a headlamp. The beam swept down, slow, methodical. It passed over the empty stairs, the rusted railing, the scree, and the rocks. And then it stopped. It didn't sweep further. It didn't move away. The powerful white beam of the headlamp was aimed directly at our small nylon dome of a tent 300 yards below the tree line. I knew deep in the cold, hollow pit of my stomach that we were not hidden. We were not ignored. Whoever was up there had been waiting. The sudden silence that followed the squeak and the appearance of the light was the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. The silence of a predator who has finally pinpointed its prey. The beam didn't move for 10 agonizing minutes. Scarlett was in full-blown panic mode, her frantic breathing hot against my neck. "They're just watching us," she whimpered the words, barely audible. "They're just watching. We had to move." I fumbled with my boots, my hands stiff and useless with terror. Staying was waiting for a trap. Hiking off trail in the dark was suicidal. But we had no choice. As I tied my laces, the headlamp finally moved. It didn't sweep away. It moved up. The beam now illuminated the very top of the old wooden railing of the tower's observation deck. And standing there, bathed in the sharp, unnatural white light, was a figure. It was tall, dressed in dark, bulky clothing that completely obscured any features. But it was definitely human, and it was holding something. It was a long, impossibly long, old-fashioned spotting scope, the kind used in the 1,940 a massive polished brass cylinder. The figure didn't move the scope. It didn't need to. It was already aimed directly at our position. I imagined that person standing utterly still in the frigid mountain air, looking through a powerful lens from an 80-year-old tower, the slow, methodical ticking of their machinery running inside the cab. They weren't just watching us, they were studying us, cataloging our fear. The figure didn't raise a hand or shout a warning. They just stood there utterly motionless, the white light illuminating the old brass scope pointing straight at us. Then from the tower cab, a new sound came. A sound that sliced through the tension like a blade. It was a sharp, loud, clear clang, like a steel trapdoor slamming shut. And immediately, the powerful white headlamp went dark. The figure was gone. We were plunged back into the deep, absolute blackness of the mountain. The only light remaining was the sickly, pale yellow beacon in the cab. The white light going out was not a reprieve. It was a signal. The sheer violence of the clang, the sound of heavy metal slamming, suggested an intentional final end to the observation period. He wasn't giving up. He was coming down. Now I hissed, pushing Scarlett toward the tent flap. "Pack. Water. Go." We didn't bother folding the tent. We left the sleeping bags, the stove, the cooking gear. The loss was meaningless. We scrambled out, plunging down the slope into the overwhelming blackness of the tree line. My headlamp stayed off. A moving light would be an easy target for a person who knew this mountain. We stumbled through the trees, the wind our only cover. We kept moving until our lungs burned, finally stopping to flatten ourselves against the cold, rough bark of a dense thicket of spruce. We were perhaps a mile down, but it felt like a marathon. I strained my ears over the wind. The yellow light was gone. The ticking was swallowed by distance. But I heard something else, a muffled, terrifying sound. The faint, distant squeak of the tower door closing. He was no longer just in the cab. He was on the ground. And then faint, but unmistakable, the loud metallic shing of a large key turning in a lock. He was locking the tower back up. He was securing his base. The methodical nature of his actions, the patient observation, the violent signal of the clang, the securing of his tower was far more terrifying than a panicked chase. It spoke of chilling focus. He was preparing to hunt us properly. We ran blindly for hours, finally collapsing into a dry clearing when the pre-dawn gray finally painted the sky. We waited shivering until full daylight before starting the grueling off-trail hike down the slopes, never daring to look back. We finally flagged down a local on the highway, shredded emotionally, physically, and spiritually. We never contacted the Forest Service. What could we say? That an unnaturally patient, silent person had tracked us with a spotlight from a supposedly abandoned tower, locked up, and descended to hunt. 2 weeks later, back in the unnatural comfort of my apartment, I was still haunted. I went to the local library, driven by the desperate need for a rational explanation. Any explanation. I pored over old Forest Service documents, searching for maintenance reports on Tower 7. I finally found a dense technical maintenance report from 1958. The entry for Tower 7 detailed its deactivation and the specific final reason for its closure in 1957. It wasn't a lack of funding or technology. It was the inexplicable loss of the watchman and his equipment. The final sentence, underlined in faded red ink, was the blow that shattered my reality. Tower 7 permanently decommissioned and all access removed, following the inexplicable loss of watchmen and equipment. The man, a known loner, had a penchant for repairing and manually operating old large naval chronometers in the cab. All reports indicate the last audible sound before he vanished was the slow, rhythmic ticking of his machinery. My blood turned to ice. The man who had been in the cabin 50 years ago had vanished. But the ticking sound, the hallmark of his extreme solitude, had remained. The terror was not that a hunter had been watching us. The terror was that the thing watching us was engaging in an intentional, dedicated, personalized reenactment of a long-vanished ghost's ritual. It was a ceremonial act of psychological terror, and to this day, I can't shake the memory. When the silence in my apartment is too deep, I can hear a sound that isn't the wind, or the pipes, or the traffic. It's just a faint, steady tick, tock. A sound that tells me a lonely, methodical vigil is being kept. A silent watcher keeping time, waiting for me to finally break. The UARI isn't a vast wilderness like Montana or Arizona. It's a patchwork of dense, secondary growth forest, dotted with old logging roads and small, barely used campsites. It feels less remote, but somehow more closed in. I was hiking with my sister, Evelyn. She was the anchor, a woman of unflappable, practical patience. We were 3 days into a 5-day hike, navigating a confusing, unmarked portion of the woods near an old, defunct gold mine. The forest here was dramatically different from the surrounding hardwoods. It was a massive, dense plantation of towering, identical loblolly pines, planted so close together that the canopy above was a near impenetrable, light-starved roof. It felt less like a natural forest and more like a colossal, living maze, a perfect place to disappear. We made camp near a small, marshy pond that evening. It was a beautiful spot, eerily quiet beneath the tight, high canopy of the pines. We were sitting around a small, contained fire when Evelyn froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, holding her hand up. I listened. Nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the low, constant, monotonous shh of the wind moving through the needles 70 feet above us. The air in the plantation was always subtly loud, a low-grade white noise. "Hear what?" I asked. "A voice," she insisted, her brow furrowed. Just for a second. Sounded like a child. I immediately dismissed it. "It's the wind, Evelyn. It's playing tricks up there. You've got the pines and the water. It's an acoustical phenomenon." She nodded slowly, clearly trying to believe me. But an hour later, it happened again. We were packing up our food canisters to hang them from a bear-proof cable. This time, I heard it too. It wasn't a child's voice. It was a faint, high-pitched, almost synthetic sound. It was fleeting, cutting through the shh of the pines like a sudden, sharp intake of breath. It sounded exactly like the word leave, drawn out, whispered on the wind, but with an unnerving, machine-like purity. It seemed to come from directly behind us, across the pond, where the rows of pines disappeared into the darkening woods. We spun around, our headlamps blazing, sweeping the area. Nothing, just the tight, dark columns of the trees, marching away in perfect, terrifying rows. "Okay," Evelyn said, her voice now tight with a rising apprehension. That was not the wind. My logical center was fighting a losing battle. The sound was too directed, too specific to be a trick of the acoustics. I considered the possibility of other hikers. But in 3 days, we hadn't seen a soul. And even if it was someone, what kind of person hides in a pine maze and whispers a single, electronically pure command? "It's a recording," I stated, forcing a breathy, rational tone. "Someone's playing a prank, maybe a remote-controlled speaker. A prank that cost someone a day's hike into the deepest part of the Uwari," Evelyn countered, already drawing out a length of rope to hang our food, her movements jerky and anxious. "Who does that?" That night, we hung our food, built the fire up high, and sat facing the impenetrable darkness of the pines, both of us listening for the impossible whisper. The unnerving sound did not return, but something else did. Around midnight, a small, barely perceptible sound began to emerge from the endless shh of the pines. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming. It wasn't the sound of heavy machinery. It was too soft, too close. It sounded like a massive, organic heart beating, or maybe a very large, powerful fan, rotating at a constant, slow speed, vibrating the ground beneath us. And as the thrumming continued, the constant sound of the wind through the pines seemed to change. The shh was still there, but now it felt like it was spelling out words. I couldn't make out what they were, but the wind no longer sounded like undifferentiated white noise. It sounded like 10,000 voices, high above, all whispering the same frantic, unintelligible message. I lay awake, paralyzed in my sleeping bag, listening to the ground thrum and the silent air fill with the sound of a giant, invisible choir, all frantically urging us to leave. We survived the night, the thrumming fading only as the first light of dawn bleached the color from the sky. The forest was once again just a maze of trees and a low shh. But the psychological damage was done. We were jumpy, exhausted, and desperately trying to hold onto the shared reality that this was all just a fluke. "We need to get out of the pine maze today," I told Evelyn as we packed up. "We'll hit the old logging road by noon." We were rushing, driven by the intense fear of another night in the plantation. As I cinched the final strap on my pack, Evelyn gasped. "My rope," she said, her voice barely a breath. "Look." She held up the thick, quarter-inch nylon rope we had used to hang our food. It was completely intact, save for one spot. About 4 feet from the end, the rope had been cut. Not sawed, not frayed, not snapped under tension. The fibers were melted clean through, creating 2 perfectly smooth, fused ends. It had been cut with a hot blade, the kind of surgical, intentional action that leaves no doubt. Our food had hung all night by a single, thin filament of fused nylon, a trick of physics holding it together. It could have dropped at any time, a disaster for our supply chain. "It had to be a knife," Evelyn whispered, her face pale. "A hot knife. Someone came to the tree and melted it." The rational veneer finally shattered. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't a speaker. This was a dedicated, meticulous person. But the question remained, why? If the person wanted to sabotage us, why not cut the entire rope? Why use a hot knife that created a fused end that could hold just long enough to ensure we found it? The answer was chilling, psychological intimidation. He wasn't trying to destroy us. He was trying to break us. He wanted us to know that he was close enough to touch our gear, to make our most vital piece of safety equipment, a hair's breadth from failure, and then retreat back into the rows of identical trees, leaving the evidence behind, like a sick calling card. We hiked out in a frenzy. The low shh of the pines was no longer a comforting white noise. It was the combined, amplified sound of thousands of invisible eyes watching our every move. Every slight shift in the air, every unusual break in the rows of pines, sent a jolt of pure fear through me. We finally reached the logging road, an old, overgrown two-track barely wide enough for a truck. We started power walking down the middle of it, desperate to get back to the main highway, where we had parked our car. We had been walking for an hour, the pines finally beginning to give way to normal hardwoods, when we stopped. The road was blocked, not by a fallen tree or a landslide. It was blocked by a makeshift, deliberate barricade of rusted, jagged logging equipment, broken cables, old, spiked metal wheels, and splintered railroad ties, all wired together with heavy-gauge fencing wire. It looked like a medieval trap. The barricade was clearly not old. The wire was new and shiny, pulled taut. This had been erected, quickly and deliberately, to stop us. "He's ahead of us," Evelyn said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "He's been setting traps. He's trying to redirect us." We had two choices: go back into the pine maze and risk spending the night with the Whispering Choir, or try to navigate the dense, untracked woods around the barricade. We chose the woods. We moved slowly, pushing through thick brush, trying to circle the barricade. After 10 minutes of grueling work, we found ourselves looking down into a small, dark ravine, and that's when we saw it. At the bottom of the ravine, almost perfectly hidden beneath a tangled mess of kudzu and briars, was a small, crudely built wooden shelter, a shack constructed entirely out of old, blackened railroad ties and sheets of corrugated tin. The door to the shack was slightly ajar, and from the opening, the sound was coming again. It wasn't a whisper now. It was a high, rapid, mechanical whirring, like a small motor running at an inhumanly fast speed. It was the source of the low-grade, rhythmic thrumming we had heard all night. And over the whirring, I could finally make out the real sound of the whispers, now amplified, distorted, and horrifyingly clear. They were coming from a small, gray plastic megaphone, tied to a metal stake next to the shack. The sound it produced was a loop, a continuous, rapid-fire playback of a single, synthesized word, pitch shifted high, and given a heavy, static reverb. Leave, 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 leave. It wasn't a child. It wasn't a ghost. It was a machine designed to make the constant wind noise of the pines sound like 1,000 frantic, whispering voices, driven by a patient, meticulous human being who had been meticulously tracking us since the day we arrived. The sight of the shack, the aggressive barrier, and the sound of the manic, repeating, mechanical whisper finally tipped us into full-blown, raw panic. This wasn't a loner. This was an active, psychological predator who had orchestrated an environment of total sensory terror. "Run! Get to the highway!" I shouted, pushing Evelyn away from the ravine. We didn't bother trying to circle back to the road. We sprinted in the only direction we had left, straight down the mountain slope, crashing through the tangled underbrush, hoping that the straight line was the one path the barricade couldn't cover. Behind us, the manic "leave, leave, leave" was joined by a new, more terrifying sound, the loud crack of dry brush being violently snapped, coming up the ravine behind us. He had heard us. He was running. We ran blindly, adrenaline overriding all pain, all logic. We were aiming for the low-level sound of traffic, the faint, buzzing promise of civilization that lay miles ahead. As we neared the bottom of the slope, the woods opened up suddenly into a large, muddy field, an old clear cut that backed up directly onto the main highway. We scrambled across the mud, our lungs screaming, our eyes fixed on the ribbon of asphalt. We reached the barbed wire fence that marked the highway's edge. I threw my pack over and pulled at the bottom wire, wrenching it up enough for Evelyn to slide under. She screamed as the wire snagged her jacket, but she was through. As I was sliding under, I glanced back at the tree line. Standing exactly at the edge of the woods, where the deep shadows of the forest met the glaring sun of the field, was a figure, tall, bulky, and obscured by the dark silhouette of the trees. He wasn't running. He was just standing there, absolutely still, the whirring "leave, leave, leave" now faint with distance. He lifted his arm. It was a deliberate, slow movement. He wasn't holding a knife, or a gun, or a trap. He was holding something small, round, and white. He raised it to his eye, just like the old brass spotting scope from the fire tower. It was too far to tell what it was, but I knew what the gesture meant. He was looking at us. He was marking us. I scrambled out from under the wire and onto the burning asphalt of the highway, pulling Evelyn up and dragging her toward our parked car. a half-mile down the shoulder. We reached the car, threw the packs into the trunk, and peeled out onto the highway without a second thought. I didn't breathe until we hit the first town, an hour later. We filed a report, of course. The police did a courtesy patrol, found the rusted barricade, and confirmed the old shack, but they found no one fitting our description, and no leave machine. We sounded like two hikers who had panicked. The sheer psychological terror of the Uwari wasn't in the fear of death, but in the calculated, meticulous precision of the stalker. He hadn't whispered on the wind. He had built a machine to create the sound of 1,000 voices, driving us into his carefully laid out trap. He was a performance artist of fear, but the real, persistent horror, the thing that clings to my sleep, isn't the memory of the whispering choir. It's the sound I now hear when I'm alone in my apartment, on a quiet night, when the silence is too deep. It's a subtle, almost imperceptible sound that seems to come from the deep recesses of the walls, or maybe just inside my own ear. It's the sound of nylon rope fibers being melted and fused together, a soft, high-pitched ss, the sound of meticulous, intentional sabotage. The man in the pines hadn't just told us to leave. He had shown us, with his carefully severed rope and his mechanical choir, that he can get close, that he knows how to manipulate reality, and that our fear is his only audience. And every time I hear that faint, high-pitched sizzle, I know that somewhere, the sound of the wind is being collected, filtered, and amplified, waiting for the right moment to deliver its one, simple, inescapable command: leave. There's a certain kind of silence you only hear deep in the woods, the kind that makes you aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every instinct screaming that something ancient is watching you. That quiet, the heavy, suffocating kind is where this story lives. A few years ago, my friend Owen and I headed into the Tonto National Forest in Arizona. If you've never been there, imagine endless canyons, dry washes twisted like veins, and silence so thick it rings in your ears. We weren't planning a full expedition, just a 4-day loop through a remote canyon system hikers don't talk about much. On the second morning, the sun was crawling up the rim of a canyon, lighting everything in a gold so bright it almost looked unreal. We were feeling good, making great time, following cairns, trail markers made of stacked rocks toward a narrow pass. Then we saw it, a cairn standing 3 feet high. But unlike the others, this one was built from dark, smooth river stones, heavy stones. Stones that didn't exist anywhere near this part of the canyon, unless someone hauled them there manually. The entire forest around us was pale sandstone. This thing stuck out like a bruise. And on top, balanced perfectly, was a porcelain doll's head. Its eyes were a vacant, icy blue, too clean, too white, too new to be something left behind accidentally. Owen shrugged it off. Probably someone's weird idea of trail art. I wanted to believe him, but there was something disturbingly intentional about it. The doll's eyes were pointed directly down the trail we were heading. 2 hours later, after accidentally following a game trail into a dry wash, we climbed up an embankment to reconnect with the main route. That's when Owen froze. "There's no way," he whispered. Another cairn, same black river rocks, sama porcelain head, same blue eyes watching us. But this time, we were nowhere near any official trail. Whatever built that first cairn shouldn't have known we'd end up here. Hell, we didn't know we'd end up here. I felt something cold settle under my ribs. This wasn't marking a path. This was marking us. We pushed hard to get back to the main route, barely talking. Every time we stopped to sip water or check the map, the forest felt too quiet. Like someone, or something, was listening. Hours later, we reached the basin where we planned to camp. A small alcove near a spring. The place should have felt safe, sheltered. But the moment we dropped our packs, I noticed something that stopped me mid-step. On a tree trunk, about 7 feet up, was a square of red surveyor's tape. Fresh, bright, perfectly placed. Not marking a trail, not marking a boundary, marking our camp. I peeled it off the tree. The adhesive was still tacky. Someone had stood here. Recently. Maybe while we were setting up. I didn't tell Owen. Not then. He was already fraying at the edges, pretending logic could still protect him. Night swallowed the canyon fast. We ate quietly, near a small fire that barely kept the darkness at bay. Every sound felt wrong, every shadow too deep. By the time we climbed into the tent, the silence was unbearable. About an hour later, Owen whispered, "Did you hear that?" At first I thought he was just scaring himself, but then I heard it too. A dragging sound. Soft, rhythmic, like a heavy canvas bag being pulled across rocks. It circled our tent in slow, deliberate arcs. Slish, scrape, pause. Slish, scrape, pause. Not an animal, not wind. Something aware. We went rigid, terrified to breathe, let alone move. After several long minutes, the dragging stopped. The forest fell into a silence so thick it hummed. Then, slish, scrape, closer this time. The darkness outside pressed against the thin nylon of the tent, and then I saw it. A shadow. Tall. Too tall. Human-shaped, but wrong. A vertical smear of blackness standing right outside our tent flap. The silhouette didn't move. It just watched. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my body wouldn't obey. Owen made a small, strangled sound, and I clamped a hand over his mouth. Then, something slammed against the tent, inches from my head. A heavy, blunt force that made the tent pole groan. Not a strike, not an attack. A delivery. A sound followed. A deep, wet thud, like a large stone being dropped into place. Then something worse. A low humming. Not musical, not human in any comforting way. A mindless, focused drone. And behind the humming, a new sound. The sound of stones tapping against each other. I realized what it was doing. It was stacking rocks. It was building a cairn around our tent, marking us in the darkness. I don't know where the burst of courage came from, but I grabbed my knife from the tent organizer and waited for the next stone to drop. As the thud hit, I ripped open a lateral zipper, not the flap, and slashed my way out. "Run," I hissed. We tumbled into the freezing night. The shadow near the fire pit turned its head toward us. It didn't chase. It didn't shout. It just followed with its eyes, as though analyzing our escape. We ran blindly through brush and loose soil, tearing our hands open on branches, stumbling over rocks. We didn't stop until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. Eventually, we collapsed in a dry creek bed, clinging to each other, waiting for sunrise like it was salvation. When morning finally arrived, the canyon looked ordinary again, beautiful even, but the fear hadn't dissolved. It had fermented into something thicker. "We need the water filter," Owen whispered. "We have to go back." We returned to camp in daylight, knives out, hands shaking. The sight waiting for us froze the blood in our veins. The man hadn't been attacking us. He'd been decorating. Half a cairn stood beside the tent, built with those same heavy river stones. A semicircle of black rock hugging the side of the tent where the thump had hit. But worse was the ground beside it. Someone had arranged the shattered pieces of 3 porcelain doll heads into a perfect mosaic of a face, blue eyes staring upward from the dirt, and in the dead center of the cracked face was the piece of fresh red tape I'd taken from the tree, weighted down by a single black stone. He'd watched me hide it. He'd retrieved it while we slept. He'd placed it back as a message. He wasn't marking the trail. He was marking us. We didn't waste another second after seeing that mosaic. We grabbed only the essentials, water filter, 2 half-pack bags, knives, and left everything else where it lay. Sleeping bags, stove, extra food, all of it. The weight wasn't worth the risk. Not when we knew what was out here with us. Not when we knew he had marked us the way one might tag prey. We climbed the ridge in brutal silence, following deer paths and unstable shale instead of the actual trail. Anywhere he might expect us to go, we avoided. We stayed exposed, even though it made us feel like animals in an open field. But the danger of falling was better than the danger of being followed. We moved nonstop for 16 hours. Not speaking, not thinking, just running from that humming, from that shadow, from those dead blue doll eyes. By the time we found a safe ledge where we could finally collapse, the sun had dipped low, bleeding orange and pink across the canyon. The world felt too quiet again, too watchful. Owen sat down hard and buried his face in his hands. I could see he'd reached the limit of what his logical, rational mind could withstand. "What was he?" he finally croaked. "Human," I said. "Just wrong. But the truth was, I didn't know. Humans don't move like he did. Humans don't appear where they shouldn't be, hours apart, building things they shouldn't know to build. Humans don't watch with that kind of patience. Humans don't stalk strangers in the wilderness just to build cairns around their tent. We barely slept that night, 2 hours at most, taking shifts, listening for that dragging sound, waiting for the humming to creep up the canyon wall, waiting for the shadow to reappear. It never did. Not that night, not the next morning, but the woods never loosened their grip. When the sun finally came up, bleaching the sky pale yellow, we continued hiking along the ridge. Every time we had to descend, even for a few minutes, nerves ripped through us like static. We weren't scared of what was ahead. We were scared of what was behind. Hours later, we finally reached familiar ground, a section of trail we recognized from the first day. Something about seeing that dusty, sun-beaten path felt like surfacing from a nightmare. Owen actually laughed. It wasn't happy. More like a release valve letting out panic before it burst. "We're close," he said. "We're almost out." And we were. Another 4 miles and we'd be at the trailhead. But the forest didn't let us go easy. Half a mile down the trail, I stopped so abruptly Owen almost ran into me. There, in the middle of the path, was a single dark river rock. Not a pile, not a cairn, just one stone, placed dead center in our route. There were no others around, no river nearby, no reason for it to be there. The message was clear. He had been here, ahead of us, watching the trail we would eventually walk. Owen's face drained of all color. No, we left him behind. There's no way he wasn't following us," I said. I could barely get the words out. He was anticipating us. A sound cracked through the silence, a twig snapping somewhere deep in the brush, too far to see, too close to ignore. We didn't wait around. We kept moving, fast walking until our legs burned. Every few minutes I glanced behind us, certain I'd see that tall, impossible silhouette stepping out onto the trail. But the only thing behind us was the wind. We made it back to the trailhead just as the sun was beginning its slow descent, turning the edges of the world gold again. The moment we saw the faded wooden sign for the parking lot, Owen sprinted ahead, almost tripping in the dirt. Our car was there, untouched, a miracle in itself. We threw our bags inside and took off down the remote highway, without speaking, without thinking. Only when civilization finally came into view did Owen exhale, shoulders slumping like he'd been holding that breath for days. But for me, the fear didn't end. Not then. Not ever. Because there was one final detail I never told Owen. When I opened the passenger door and sat down, something caught my eye. On the ground beside my door, resting neatly in the dust, was another river rock. Dark, heavy, perfectly out of place. Not just that. Underneath it was a square of red surveyor's tape, the same type I'd pulled off that tree. Fresh, bright, untouched. He had followed us, all the way out, all the way to the edge of the forest. And he had left one final marker. A warning, a message, a reminder. That night, back in my own bed, listening to the noise of an actual neighborhood cars, sprinklers, distant dogs, I should have felt safe. But safety wasn't something I understood anymore. Because somewhere in the small hours of the morning, I woke up to a familiar sound. Faint at first, almost easy to ignore. A quiet, low humming. Monotonous, patient, rhythmic. I sat up in bed, breath caught in my throat. The house was dark, and the humming, it was distant. Like someone humming to themselves while they worked outside. Stacking, building, waiting. I tried to tell myself it was a neighbor, a generator, a distant AC unit. But then, click, click, click. The unmistakable sound of stones tapping together, measuring, aligning, shaping something deliberate. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. And even now, years later, sometimes, when I'm walking a familiar trail, I'll see a marker that looks a little too deliberate, a pile of rocks that shouldn't be there, or a single stone placed where no stone should be. And I'll feel my hand drift into my pocket, searching for something that isn't there anymore. That square of bright, fresh red tape. Because he didn't mark the trail. He marked me, and I'm terrified he always will.